Sweat dripped onto the canvas, smelling of old copper and cheap resin. Blood wasn't drawn yet, but the crowd already tasted it. They didn't come for martial arts, they came for a slaughter. Arthur Vance promised to break a legend. 10 seconds later, the giant was screaming for his life. Dust motes danced in the harsh, stuttering glare of the single halogen bulb swinging above the locker room bench. Bruce stared at his wrapped hands, flexing his fingers until the knuckles popped in rapid, dry succession. The athletic tape felt stiff and chalky, binding his hands into dense, calculated weapons. Outside the thin drywall of his dressing room, a low, rhythmic thumping vibrated through the cracked floorboards, 3,000 boots stomping in unison. They wanted a spectacle. They wanted blood. Julian, a mid-level promoter trapped in a cheap suit and a chronic nicotine habit, paced the cramped space. He chewed aggressively on an unlit cigar, leaving flakes of damp brown tobacco on his sweat-stained collar. He's massive, Bruce. I'm telling you, the freight scales at the loading dock bottomed out, Julian muttered, his voice trembling with a mixture of greed and genuine panic. 700 pounds of sheer farm-fed meat. You don't have to do this. The contract has a weight discrepancy clause. We can walk. Take a hit on the advance, but we walk. Contract says I fight who you put in front of me, Julian, Bruce interrupted. His voice lacked the booming theatricality the fans expected. It was quiet, possessing a dense, heavy quality that forced the older man to stop pacing. Bruce rubbed his left shoulder. A dull ache throbbed deep within the rotator cuff, a lingering ghost from a heavy sparring session 3 weeks prior. He wasn't a god. He was an athlete in his early 30s, chronically sleep-deprived, nursing minor injuries, and acutely aware of his own fragile carbon-based biology. He stood up. The wooden bench groaned, relieved of his dense, coiled weight. The hallway leading to the underground arena smelled intensely of spilled draft beer, urinal cakes, and the sharp, acidic tang of human adrenaline. Bruce walked with a slight, almost imperceptible limp, a calculated looseness to conserve energy and keep his muscles warm. He's been talking to the press all week. Julian scurried to keep pace, his leather shoes squeaking on the slick concrete. Vance said he's going to snap your spine like a dry twig, said he's ending the career of the great Bruce Lee tonight. The crowd believes him. Look at the odds. Bruce snorted, a short, ugly sound of dismissal. People always waxed poetic about his legendary discipline, his philosophical calm. They rarely saw the sheer, grating irritation that clawed at his chest when talentless behemoths convinced themselves that gross tonnage equated to martial superiority. It was a profound insult to the thousands of agonizing hours he had spent destroying his knuckles on heavy bags, to the bone-deep exhaustion of perfecting the biomechanics of a single pivot. Arthur Vance was a mountain of a man, a former strongman competitor who had recently figured out there was significantly more money in unregulated, underground prize fighting. Bruce had watched the grainy 8mm tapes. Vance didn't punch, he dropped his weight, he didn't grapple. He smothered his opponents until their ribs cracked under the pressure. The heavy velvet curtain parted. Sound hit Bruce like a physical blunt force blow. It wasn't the polite applause of a martial arts tournament. It was a roar of predatory anticipation. Smoke hung incredibly thick in the air, a toxic gray canopy trapping the suffocating heat of 3,000 breathing bodies. The ring canvas was a mosaic of brown and yellow splotches, telling silent stories of desperate men who had fought for a fraction of what Julian was stuffing into his briefcase tonight. Bruce climbed through the ropes. He didn't vault over them with cinematic flair. He slipped through meticulously, testing the tension of the top cord with a gloved hand, noting the slight sag in the center. Across the ring stood Vance. Hearing the number 700 was an abstract concept. Seeing it breathing, sweating, and aggressively displacing the ambient air in the room was a visceral shock. Vance wore custom-stitched, reinforced canvas shorts that strained violently against thighs the size of oak barrels. His chest was a slab of thick, pallid muscle buried under a dense layer of functional, protective fat. He didn't look like a bodybuilder. He He looked like a localized geological formation. Vance leaned heavily over the top rope, hawking a glob of thick phlegm onto the ring apron. He locked eyes with Bruce. The giant's pupils were blown wide, glassy with either pre-fight chemical stimulants or sheer unadulterated adrenaline. "I'll end your career tonight, little man," Vance rumbled. The deep bass of his voice actually vibrated in Bruce's sternum. It wasn't a boast meant to sell tickets. Vance genuinely believed it. He believed that elementary physics, mass times acceleration, was an inescapable, undeniable absolute. Bruce didn't smile. He didn't offer a traditional bow. He just stared blankly at the soft, unprotected hollow of Vance's throat, his mind rapidly calculating the exact degree of kinetic force required to collapse a trachea buried beneath layers of adipose tissue. He felt the cold, hard reality of the wooden ring floor through the thin soles of his slippers. He breathed in deeply, tasting stale tobacco smoke and stale sweat, and forcibly settled his own heart rate down to a slow, methodical, rhythmic thud. The crowd's deafening noise slowly morphed into a sustained guttural hum in Bruce's ears. He dragged his big toe across the canvas, feeling the coarse friction, mapping the slippery spots where beer had spilled. He genuinely hated these exhibitions. They compromised the purity of the art. Yet, a dark, deeply buried, ugly streak of competitiveness, a part of himself he rarely admitted to, craved the sheer, unadulterated absurdity of the challenge. Could 145 pounds systematically dismantle a human tank? The physics equation demanded a violent answer. Julian was leaning precariously through the ropes, screaming something incoherent about playing to the cameras mounted on rickety steel tripods at ringside. Bruce tuned him out entirely. He focused intensely on Vance's breathing pattern. It was shallow for a man of that immense size. Labored. Just the sheer physiological effort of keeping 700 pounds upright against gravity was a massive cardiovascular tax. That was the foundational weakness. Mass requires immense oxygen. Bruce shifted his weight laterally, rolling his neck. A deeply satisfying series of pops echoed in his own inner ear, drowning out the screaming crowd for a fraction of a millisecond. He was acutely aware of his own fatal vulnerability. One mistake, one microscopic miscalculation in distance or timing, and Vance wouldn't just knock him unconscious. The giant would literally crush his ribcage into splinters. The rational, survival-driven part of Bruce's brain screamed at the utter lunacy of the situation. He was a philosopher, an innovator. And here he was, locked in a sweaty cage with a circus freak for the fleeting amusement of degenerate gamblers. But as Vance aggressively pounded his massive taped fists together, sending visible shockwaves rippling up his own forearms, the philosopher evaporated. The animal remained. Cold, hyper-calculating, and singularly focused on survival through absolute surgical destruction. Donovan, the designated referee, stepped hesitantly to the center of the ring. He was a small, balding man with nervous eyes, looking entirely out of place, standing between a hardened martial arts icon and a literal titan. He smelled overwhelmingly of cheap peppermint schnapps and fear sweat. "No biting, no eye gouging. Protect yourselves at all times," Donovan shouted over the deafening din, barely looking either man in the eye, waving them haphazardly to the center. Bruce didn't step forward. He let Vance take 3 heavy, lumbering steps toward the center. The plywood boards beneath the thin canvas groaned in loud, cracking protest. Vance's massive shadow stretched out under the harsh lights, swallowing Bruce entirely. "I'm going to snap you in half and mail you home," Vance hissed, thick saliva flecking Bruce's cheek. It was warm, disgusting. Bruce merely blinked, slowly wiping the spit away with the rough tape on the back of his thumb. 10 seconds, Bruce murmured, his voice so quiet and utterly devoid of emotion that only Vance and the trembling Donovan could hear it. "That's all you get." Donovan desperately dropped his hand and scurried backward. "Fight!" The bell shrieked, a sharp metallic clang that cut through the roar of the crowd. Vance didn't bother assuming a fighting stance. He simply lunged. It was terrifyingly, impossibly fast for a man carrying that much weight. 700 pounds surged forward like a derailed locomotive, arms spread impossibly wide, fully intent on wrapping Bruce in a crushing bear hug that would shatter vertebrae and end the bout immediately. The air pressure in the center of the ring visibly shifted. Bruce felt the wind of the giant's sudden movement a fraction of a second before the physical impact arrived. He didn't block. Blocking a force that massive was undeniable suicide. Instead, Bruce violently dropped his center of gravity, sinking into a deep, agonizingly tight horse stance. His knees screamed in sharp protest as they absorbed the immense torque of his sudden deceleration. He slid diagonally, slipping directly underneath the giant's grasping left arm. His right slipper caught a damp, slick patch of canvas, nearly sending him sprawling, but his hyper-developed core compensated with a brutal twisting correction. Vance's massive arms slammed shut on completely empty air. The sheer momentum carried the giant stumbling forward, his heavy boots skidding wildly on the canvas as he fought to halt his own mass. Bruce was already moving. He didn't aim for the head. The jaw was sitting far too high, the neck heavily protected by thick rolling traps and hunched shoulders. He relentlessly targeted the structural foundation. 1 second. Bruce pivoted sharply on his left foot, driving his right heel directly into the side of Vance's lead, weight-bearing knee. He didn't kick with a snappy point-scoring motion. He kicked with the dark intention of driving his heel completely through the joint. The sound was deeply sickening. A wet, fibrous thwack followed immediately by a sharp, resonant crack, exactly like a thick, dry branch snapping violently under a heavy boot. 2 seconds. Vance roared, a guttural sound born of absolute, bewildered shock rather than immediate pain. The giant stumbled sideways, his massive right leg instantly buckling inward, but his sheer forward momentum was still carrying him, and his tree-trunk arms flailed blindly in a desperate attempt to find purchase or balance. A blind backhand, sporting a fist the size of a canned ham, accidentally clipped Bruce high on the left shoulder. The impact was jarring, a blunt explosion of force. Bruce's vision blurred sharply at the outer edges. A hot electrical pain shot violently down his left arm, instantly numbing his fingertips. He stumbled backward, tasting copper in the back of his throat. He had arrogantly underestimated the sheer ambient danger of Vance's heavy limbs simply moving through the air. 4 seconds. Bruce firmly planted his back foot. He refused to retreat further. Retreating gave the giant precious milliseconds to stabilize his ruined base. Ignoring the numbness in his arm, Bruce stepped aggressively inside the wide arc of Vance's flailing reach, suddenly enveloped in the sour, suffocating tang of unwashed hair and rank, nervous body odor. He struck. Not with a wide, looping, closed fist, which would likely shatter his own hand against the incredibly dense bone of Vance's ribs. He utilized a tight vertical chain of rapid punches, a swift pak-sao parry to violently clear the giant's dropping left arm, instantly followed by 3 rapid-fire, piston-like strikes directly to the solar plexus. 5 seconds. To the drunken crowd, the strikes didn't look devastating. They were incredibly short, generating kinetic power entirely from the violent torque of Bruce's hips, traveling mere inches before impact. But they landed with mathematical precision directly on the dense cluster of nerves sitting vulnerable beneath Vance's thick sternum. Vance's ragged breath violently hitched. The immense sweating wall of flesh shuddered uncontrollably. 6 seconds. Before the giant's brain could even register the necessity to gasp for oxygen, Bruce drastically shifted his attack angle. He drove a rigid, heavily taped spear hand strike directly upward into the soft, unprotected tissue of Vance's throat, landing precisely an inch below the Adam's apple. He consciously pulled the kinetic force of the strike at the very last possible millimeter, delivering exactly enough trauma to cause an immediate, terrifying spasm of the trachea, but deliberately not enough to crush the cartilage and kill the man. 8 seconds! Vance's eyes practically bugged out of his heavy skull. The whites showed entirely, threaded instantly with thick, furious red veins. Both of his massive hands flew desperately to his own throat, clawing frantically at his own thick neck as his airway violently seized shut. His massive frame swayed precariously, resembling a skyscraper whose foundational support columns had been simultaneously detonated. 9 seconds. Bruce dropped low, hooking his calf behind Vance's remaining good leg, and violently swept it out from under him. The giant, already suffocating and entirely off balance, couldn't possibly compensate. Gravity, previously Vance's greatest weapon, turned violently against him. 700 pounds of dense meat, water, and bone crashed freely onto the unyielding canvas. The entire physical structure of the ring seemingly levitated an inch off its concrete moorings. The noise of the impact was utterly deafening, a localized earthquake that instantly knocked one of the heavy steel camera tripods at ringside crashing into the press row. A thick, choking cloud of ancient dust, dried sweat, and chalk exploded violently upward from the mat. 10 seconds. Vance lay flat on his broad back, thrashing blindly in the chalky dust. He was suffocating, his trachea locked in a terrifying spasm, his right knee entirely ruined. He wasn't trying to fight anymore. He was actively drowning inside his own failing body. He pounded one massive taped fist onto the canvas. It wasn't an act of defiance. It was a frantic, terrifying plea for survival. He looked frantically past Bruce, his glassy, bloodshot eyes fixing desperately on the pale face of Donovan, the referee. A choked, horrifyingly wet gurgling sound escaped Vance's blue lips. He slapped the mat again, harder, frantic. He was tapping. The giant was begging for it to end. Donovan froze. The referee stood paralyzed, a small man caught in the terrifying epicenter of sudden, inexplicable violence. He stared down at the sheer mountain of flesh, writhing at the tips of his cheap leather shoes, entirely unable to process the total collapse of physics he had just witnessed. Bruce didn't wait for the official stoppage. He turned his back on the choking giant. The numbness in his left arm was rapidly evolving into a deep, sickening throb. He squeezed his left hand into a fist, testing the nerve response. It felt sluggish, heavy. It was a stark, painful reminder that even a glancing blow from a man carrying that much mass carried enough kinetic energy to completely scramble human wiring. For exactly 3 seconds, the underground arena was terrifyingly silent. The collective breath of 3,000 degenerate gamblers, bloodseekers, and minor crime bosses caught entirely in their throats. The only sound echoing in the cavernous, smoke-filled room was the desperate, wet rasping of Arthur Vance trying to force air past his traumatized trachea, and the sharp, rhythmic squeak of Bruce's slippers as he walked calmly toward a neutral corner. Then, the vacuum collapsed. The noise didn't return as a cheer. It erupted as a chaotic, angry explosion of pure disbelief and raw hostility. Crushed beer cups rained down from the cheap seats, splashing stale foam across the yellowed canvas. A man in the third row, wearing a cheap imitation silk shirt, started screaming obscenities, violently tearing his betting slip into confetti. They hadn't paid to see a surgical, 10-second dismantling. They had paid for a cartoonish slaughter, a prolonged gladiatorial execution, and they felt profoundly cheated by the sudden brevity of reality. Donovan finally snapped out of his stupor. He waved his arms frantically, crossing them over his chest, before dropping awkwardly to his knees beside Vance. "Medic, get the docs in here!" His voice cracked, entirely swallowed by the rising aggressive din of the crowd. 2 thick-necked men in ill-fitting paramedic polos scrambled heavily through the ropes, dragging a thick canvas medical bag that clanked loudly against the bottom turnbuckle. They hesitated as they approached Vance. The giant was rolling aggressively onto his side, clutching his neck, his face a horrifying shade of mottled purple. One paramedic reached out timidly, as if trying to soothe a wounded rhinoceros. Vance swatted blindly. The massive, uncoordinated backhand caught the paramedic square on the shoulder, sending the man sprawling backward into the ropes. Even suffocating, crippled, and grounded, the man was inherently dangerous. Bruce stood perfectly still in the corner, his back resting lightly against the rough hemp ropes. He closed his eyes. The harsh glare of the halogen overheads burned a dull red afterimage into his retinas. He focused intensely on his breathing, violently suppressing the adrenaline dump that was actively trying to shake his central nervous system apart. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic animal rhythm demanding flight. He forced it to slow. Inhale for 4 counts, hold for 2. Exhale for 4. He smelled the distinct sour metallic tang of fresh blood. He opened his eyes, glancing down at his right foot. The heavy white canvas of his slipper was stained a dark, rusty crimson. It wasn't his blood. The sheer, blunt force of driving his heel into Vance's knee had split the skin directly over the giant's patella through the heavy athletic tape. A profound wave of disgust washed over him, not just at the physical gore, but at himself. He had descended to their level. He had allowed himself to be placed inside a dirty cage like a rabid dog just to validate a fundamental truth he already knew. Julian materialized at ringside, his face a mask of sweating, ecstatic greed. He was practically vibrating, clutching his thick leather briefcase against his chest like a shield. He grabbed the top rope, his knuckles turning white. "My God, Bruce!" Julian screamed, spit flying from his lips, completely ignoring the chaotic medical emergency happening 10 feet away. 10 seconds! You literally broke him in half! The whole room is losing their minds. We can double the guarantee for the next city. Double it, they'll line up around the block to see you do it again. Bruce stared blankly at the promoter. He saw the flakes of damp tobacco still clinging to Julian's collar. He smelled the cheap musky cologne desperately masking the odor of a man who lived entirely on high-yield stress and flat commission. "There is no next city, Julian," Bruce said softly. His voice was entirely flat, devoid of the triumphant pitch Julian desperately wanted to hear. Julian's frantic smile slipped. "What? Bruce, come on, the money." The contract was for 1 exhibition," Bruce interrupted, pushing himself away from the ropes. He didn't look at Vance, who was now being awkwardly loaded onto an oversized, reinforced stretcher by 4 struggling men. "You have your spectacle. Pay me my half and never call my management again." The hallway beneath the arena felt significantly colder on the walk back. The deafening roar of the disappointed crowd was heavily muffled by the thick concrete walls, reducing the chaos to a dull rhythmic thumping, exactly like a failing heartbeat. Bruce pushed the flimsy wooden door of his dressing room open. It swung violently, the cheap brass knob denting the already scarred drywall. He collapsed onto the groaning wooden bench, letting out a long, ragged exhale. The adrenaline was rapidly draining from his system, leaving behind a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. The quiet inside the room was suddenly oppressive. He reached across his chest with his right hand, gripping the frayed edge of the athletic tape binding his left wrist. He tore it sharply. The harsh, ripping sound echoed loudly off the cinder block walls. He unwound the rigid casing, exposing knuckles that were visibly swollen and faintly bruised despite the heavy padding. His left shoulder was the real problem. He reached up, gently probing the deltoid muscle. A sharp, electric spike of pure agony shot directly up into his neck. He winced, a raw, ugly hiss escaping his clenched teeth. He wasn't indestructible. Vance's glancing blow hadn't just bruised the muscle. It had severely aggravated his old rotator cuff tear. He would need heavy ice. He would need at least a week of aggressive, painful physical therapy just to lift a heavy bag again. And for what? He stripped off his sweat-drenched silk jacket, tossing it carelessly onto the concrete floor. It landed with a wet, heavy slap. This was the bleak reality they never captured on the cinema screens. In the movies, the martial arts hero stood tall over the vanquished giant, bathed in warm golden light, possessing complete righteous clarity. In reality, Bruce sat heavily slumped on a splintering bench in a windowless room that smelled violently of ammonia and stale urine, nursing a damaged shoulder, listening to an angry crowd that actively wanted to see him murdered. The door creaked open. Julian slipped inside, clutching his leather briefcase tightly. The promoter looked deeply uncomfortable. The frantic, sweaty energy from ringside was completely gone, replaced by a nervous, transactional caution. He set the briefcase heavily on the small, rusted folding table in the corner. He popped the brass latches with 2 loud, sharp clicks. "You're cut," Julian muttered, actively avoiding Bruce's eyes. He began rapidly stacking bundles of crisp, tightly banded $100 bills onto the rickety table. Minus the 10% management fee, the venue tax, and the, hazard insurance overhead. Bruce didn't look at the money. He kept his eyes fixed firmly on the cracked linoleum floor, tracking the erratic path of a small brown cockroach scurrying toward the rotting baseboards. "I had to pay off the local precinct captain, too," Julian continued, his voice whining and defensive. "They heard about the stoppage, wanted to shut the whole operation down under the guise of an unregulated medical emergency. Cost me $5,000 just to keep the doors open so the bookies could settle up." "Leave it, Julian," Bruce said quietly. Julian stopped stacking. He stared at the back of Bruce's head, heavily conflicted. The promoter was a parasite, but he wasn't entirely stupid. He recognized the dangerous quiet shift in the ambient air of the room. "Look, Bruce, I know you hate the circus," Julian offered, trying to sound sympathetic. "But you proved your point. Everyone thought that monster was going to crush you. You showed them what real technique is." "I showed them absolutely nothing," Bruce replied. He finally turned around, his dark eyes locking onto Julian with a cold intensity that made the older man physically flinch backward. "They didn't see technique, Julian. They didn't see the biomechanics of the sweep or the kinetic chain of the strike. They saw a magic trick. They saw David drop Goliath, and they're angry because it happened too fast to satisfy their bloodlust." Bruce stood up, picking up a rough, dry cotton towel and wiping the cold sweat from his neck. "Martial arts is supposed to be about honest self-expression," Bruce continued, his voice tight with suppressed heavy frustration. "It is the perfection of the human self. Tonight was just physics applied to a meat carcass for the entertainment of degenerates. It was mathematical destruction. There is no honor in snapping a man's knee just because he is too arrogant and too heavy to properly protect it." Julian nervously wiped his shining brow with a soiled pocket handkerchief. "Well, honorable or not, the physics pay extremely well. The cash is right there. Count it if you want." "I don't need to count it." Julian lingered for a moment, shifting his weight awkwardly from foot to foot. He realized the bridge was entirely burned. There would be no lucrative rematch, no traveling underground circuit to exploit. He snapped the empty briefcase shut. "Right. Well, good fight, kid." The promoter slipped out the door, the latch clicking softly behind him. Bruce was alone again. The thumping from the arena above had finally ceased entirely. The crowd had dispersed back into the damp city streets, carrying their lost wages and their bitter disappointment into the night. He walked slowly over to the folding table and stared down at the neat stacks of money. It was more cash than most hard-working men saw in a decade. It was the physical, undeniable manifestation of his victory. Yet, it felt entirely heavy, dirty, and useless. He reached out with his uninjured right hand, lightly brushing the crisp paper of a top $100 bill. He had won the fight in 10 seconds. He had protected his body, his reputation, and his life. He had definitively proven that gross mass was a fatal liability against calculated precision. But as he stood shivering slightly in the damp, toxic air of the locker room, listening to his own shallow breathing and feeling the deep, throbbing ache in his shoulder, he knew the terrible, cynical truth. In the underground, nobody actually wins. You just survive long enough to count the dirty money before the physical damage finally catches up with you. He grabbed his heavy canvas duffel bag, zipped his nylon street jacket tightly over his bruised shoulder, and walked out into the cold, empty alleyway, leaving the shattered ghost of the giant entirely behind him. The legend of Bruce Lee isn't just built on flawless victories. It's forged in the gritty, imperfect reality of brutal physics and painful survival. This story proves that true power lies in calculated precision, not just sheer, undeniable size. If this raw, untold perspective on martial arts history gripped you, do not let it end here. Hit that like button, share this video with fellow combat fans, and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into the legendary, unfiltered reality of martial arts.